Hi, everyone. This is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the professor in environmental studies and the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. This is part of our new energy series. We're really excited today to welcome Nathan Williams. And he's talking about a topic that I think a lot of us really think a lot about. We talk often about energy access for the billion people that don't have electricity, or the 2 to 3 billion that are relying on traditional cooking fuels. But I think the point that Nathan is bringing up, and a lot of our other scholar colleagues, necessary but not sufficient, unlocking the impact of electricity access, goes beyond bare bones to really think about some of the larger questions that affect electricity access, development, and use. As you know, the New Energy Series is a series of colleagues from across the university space. Stephanie, do you have the next slide with our partners on it? And we are always looking for new people. We're getting together with the summer seminar series now, and we'll be programming for next year. One of the things I've really enjoyed are the brilliant young scholars like Nathan who make us all think about the world in new ways, and creating this community is something that we're also very, very interested in. So I am going to shut off my camera and microphone, turn it over to Nathan Williams, who is an assistant professor at the Golisano Institute for Sustainability at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and has a lot of experience working on these issues, both with Carnegie Mellon's program in Rwanda and also through his own experience in South Africa. So Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to the conversation, and I'll leave it to you.
Great, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Let me get set up here. Great to join this impressive list of speakers. Is that showing up correctly? Let me just make sure.
You have to swap it again.
Swap it again? Okay.
Yes, please.
All right, got it. Is that
perfect?
Good? Perfect. All right. Yeah, so really excited to be here. I feel like an extended member of the Dartmouth community of late. I was on a thesis committee at Dartmouth recently and did a guest lecture for a class at Dartmouth, and I have an incoming PhD student at the Dartmouth grad. So enjoying the interaction and all the great things going on at Dartmouth. So like Elizabeth said, I work a lot on, or think a lot about the sort of the nexus between electricity access and development. And, you know, thinking about ways that we can not just reach universal access, but reach universal access in a meaningful way. And so I have recently been starting some of my presentations with this picture here, just to set the context. I don't know the background of the audience exactly, so I will assume that you're not all working in electricity access specifically. You know, but there are still, you know, a large number of people without access to electricity. Recent estimates are about 770 million people don't have access to electricity in the world. And I got interested in this problem as a Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso. I spent 2 years in a small village in northern Burkina Faso, and teaching math and science in a secondary school in a community that didn't have access to electricity, barely had a road. The road got washed out in the rainy season. And the reason I show this picture is because this is, so I spent my first, say, 3 months in the community with a kerosene lamp, you know, grading my papers, preparing my lesson plans with a kerosene lamp, which is both poor quality in terms of light. There's a lot of air pollution from kerosene lamps, particulate matter in particular. It's not great for your health. And it's already hot in Burkina Faso. The last thing you want to be doing is sitting around a little fire. And so after 3 months or so, I invested in just a small 15-watt solar panel, rigged it up to a vehicle battery, and bought a fluorescent tube light, hooked up my shortwave radio, and probably generated less than 100 watt hours of electricity per day. For context, that's like a few slices of toast that you probably use in the morning. So not a lot of electricity, but really transformative. And so what we see here is this is the neighborhood kids that would come to my house every evening, probably partly to hang out with the weird looking foreigner, but also to work on their schoolwork and to take advantage of that sort of high quality electric light that they didn't have at home. And so just just toast amounts of electricity can go a long ways. And certainly improved my quality of life significantly. And so a small amount of electricity goes a long ways. I'm going to argue here that, in fact, we need to think beyond small amounts of electricity to fully benefit from electrification. But even at a low level, electricity access is important and transformative. And we've made a lot of progress. These are International Energy Agency statistics on electrification rates. And most regions of the world have made significant progress in bringing down the absolute number of people without access to electricity. The outlier has been largely sub-Saharan Africa. There has been some progress in the last decade or so in bringing down that number of people without access to electricity. So we're moving in the right direction. Although one thing to note is that and I've tried to streamline this to fit it into 30 minutes, but Africa's population is supposed to double by 2050. So there's a demographic challenge in Africa that's making this problem even worse. But we're moving in the right direction. There's a lot of new technologies that are enabling access to electricity at different levels to roll out much more quickly. Things like solar home systems. These are just sort of household scale power systems, a small solar panel connected to a battery. This is sort of like a Rolls-Royce solar home system picture here. Most of them are just lights and cell phone charging for most users. But it provides a level of access that can even power televisions, things like mini grids as well. And I work a lot with mini grid companies, mini grid developers. These are sort of typically renewable energy powered village scale power systems that are allowing us to expand access much more quickly than we could just with grid extension, and at a lower cost in many instances as well. And so the point here is that we've spent a lot of time and effort on figuring out smart ways to supply connections. There's been a lot of innovation in sort of the decentralized grid electrification space. Like I said, solar home systems and mini grids costs are coming down. There's millions and millions of people that get their electricity from solar home systems now, for example. There's been a lot of research going into how do we make decisions about how to reach universal electricity access. This map here on the right is the Rwanda National Electrification Plan. And so they've applied one of these sophisticated geospatial electrification modeling tools developed at MIT called REM to make decisions about what's the least cost way to provide electricity access in different communities across the country. And there's been some, in the last decade, we've gone from 33% to 48% electricity access rate in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're not there yet. We have a long ways to go, but we're moving in the right direction. But what I'm going to argue in this talk is that connections aren't enough. We need to think about how those connections get used, and the data that I'm seeing from partners, utilities on the continent, as well as off-grid electricity companies, is that once these new electricity users are connected, they're using very little electricity. They're supporting some basic needs, but certainly not meeting there seemed to have been an expectation within the sort of electricity access community that if you build the connections, the electricity users will take it from there, and then electricity use will just, because we all know how great electricity is, right? We use it all the time. We know how great it is. Obviously, they'll think it's great too, but we're not seeing that, right? And so here on the left, this is data from about, I think, 15 mini grids in Tanzania. This is on the y-axis here. This is log watt hours of electricity use per day. So 1 here would be about average of 10 watt hours of electricity use per day. 2 would be 100 watt hours. 3 would be a kilowatt hour. And this is segmented by type of customer. Don't worry too much about the high, medium, low classification. That was sort of for a different project. But the idea here is the vast majority of customers use well below 100 watt hours. And, that's just some LED lights and some cell phone charging, which is valuable, absolutely valuable. But there seem to be barriers to adopting electricity in larger quantities. And this isn't just isolated to off-grid systems or mini grids, where the price of electricity on these mini grids, because they are at least much less subsidized than grid extension, they're about an order of magnitude higher. So think $1 per kilowatt hour quite often, compared to maybe 10 cents or so on the grid, maybe 20 cents depending on the country. But consumption is low on the grid too. So this is this is work from some of my colleagues or collaborators at Columbia and UMass. What they did was they looked at a sample of I think 100 to 200,000 rural residential electricity consumers in Kenya. And they looked at what is the median monthly electricity consumption for those households by month since connection. So here we're looking at how does electricity use evolve after you're connected. Sort of the assumption has been that this is like an ever increasing curve, that people adopt more or adopt electricity for more applications and continually increase their electricity use. And then the y-axis here is then kilowatt hours of monthly consumption. And this is split up into cohorts based on year of connection. So 2009 being the sort of older set of customers all the way down to 2015. And so what's striking about this figure is, one, it seems pretty clear that after about a year and a half, 18 months or so, pretty much all of, well, at least the median customer has reached their plateau. They're consuming about as much electricity as they are going to consume, at least over this time series, which is several years. And they plateaued at a fairly low level. If you look at the older connections, somewhere between 30 and 35 kilowatt hours per month, the average US household uses about 877 kilowatt hours. So this is about a kilowatt hour per day, but the newer customers are about half that, somewhere around 17. And so my read on these data is that as we reach further into rural areas with electricity, people are either less capable or less interested in using electricity. And so, something that I've been thinking a lot about with my colleagues is why is that? Why don't people use more electricity? They simply don't want it, or that there are other barriers that are preventing them from benefiting from electricity access. So this is the problem both from are people getting the benefits that they could out of electricity, but also just from a financial sustainability perspective. Selling 100 watt hours per day, even at $1 per kilowatt hour on a mini grid is not particularly financially sustainable. So low levels of consumption are a challenge, as well as sustainability of electrification to the electricity business model. And so my argument here is that we need to think beyond connections. It's not really about supplying a connection, it's about what people can do with those connections. How does electricity play within this larger system? And so these are the sustainable development goals. Goal 7 is universal access to affordable, reliable, and clean, modern energy. So that being both electricity and clean cooking and the like. But I would say that, in fact, that's not really the goal. The goal is to support poverty reduction, food security, improved health and education, right? That electricity or energy sits behind these things. And so if our goal is just connections, we're going to fall short. And so, we've been thinking a lot about, well, what actually is preventing new electricity customers from increasing their consumption of electricity. So some hypotheses we've sort of thought about, could be that the cost of electricity is simply unaffordable. And there's two dimensions of that. There's the cost of actually connecting to the electricity system, which tends to be higher for grid systems, depending on what country you're talking about, than off-grid systems. And then there's a cost per unit energy. I think there's something to that. I mean, if we just compare the consumption on those mini grids versus the grid consumption in those rural areas, of course, those aren't the same sets of customers, but they're paying 10 times the price in these off-grid systems, that clearly will have an effect, and we have some data points on that. It could be they're simply not aware of the services that could be provided by electricity. They've adapted their lives to conditions without electricity, so they don't necessarily, maybe see the need for it. I liken this to my grandparents who refused to get a computer because I've lived for 80 years with a computer. What do I need one for now? It could as well be that they have a connection, but they can't afford appliances. Or they don't have access to credit or financial services to acquire those appliances. They're not available locally. And then, thinking a bit more broadly as well in terms of productive use, maybe you could get power tools to do carpentry, but if you don't have access to markets to sell your products through roads or communications infrastructure, or don't have financial services, then that electricity simply isn't sufficient by itself, right? Or maybe they just don't think that they need to use more electricity. That's the possibility we shouldn't rule out as well. But these are some hypotheses, and this is not a new problem, by the way. When the United States electrified rural areas, the Rural Electrification Agency actively promoted and supported the use of electricity. On the right, these are posters that the REA put out to promote different uses of electricity to rural people, espousing the benefits of electricity. And then bottom left here, this is like a road show that they'd actually put on to promote different appliances and uses of electricity. Important to look back historically and learn from the past. Not that these situations are exactly the same, but these are things we've dealt with before. And so one of our hypotheses that we sort of zoomed in on was, well, maybe people just can't afford appliances. And so we asked the question, well, what if new users of electricity could access credit to acquire electrical appliances? Our hypothesis was that there would be demand for these appliances. It would be high, and that because they would have more appliances, they would use more electricity, which would reflect, one, that they are benefiting more from electricity services, and two, it would help sustain these mini grids economically by generating more revenues. And so we ran an experiment in partnership with the Mini Grid Innovation Laboratory, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And we offered credit at market-related rates. I believe that's around 30% annual interest rate to mini grid customers across 27 villages in Kenya and Tanzania. We had, I think, 4 different mini grid developers participating. And this credit was specifically to acquire electricity or electrical appliances that would be provided by the mini grid operator, so delivered to their door by their mini grid operator. And so what did we want to know? Well, one, we wanted to know what was the demand for this. Did it seem like if people were offered some credit facility to acquire appliances, would there be interest in that? Basically testing is this that there's no interest in using electricity for other things, or is it a financial barrier? And we distributed 544 appliances to 378 customers. I think we had a budget of $200,000, which was spent very quickly. We were oversubscribed, and in fact, some of the developers offered appliances on credit outside of our intervention, which has sort of confounded our results a bit. That's one of the challenges of working in the real world. We logged hourly electricity consumption using the smart meters on these mini grids. We also tracked loan repayments to understand, yes, people want appliances on credit, but are they actually able to pay for them at the end of the day? And then for sort of practical reasons, we weren't able to randomize who were offered these appliances. And so we constructed a control group using matching techniques between participating and non-participating customers to try and evaluate, what's the treatment effect, what's on electricity consumption, which I will get to. Appliances by and large were sort of focused on entertainment, television, speakers, satellite dishes and decoders. Having spent 2 years in the village, there isn't a lot to do. I can understand this. They're not particularly income generating appliances for the most part. Refrigerators and freezers came in sort of further down the list, but also a big big draw. These actually tend to be more productive use, sort of businesses and restaurants and things like this that are selling cold drinks. And the televisions can be productive. There's a lot of video clubs too. The big thing to do on the weekend is to watch the Premier League at the video club. And if they have cold beer, then that's like the place to be. And then in smaller numbers, there's some productive use appliances like power tools and things like this, but those were relatively lower in demand. And so what did we see? So what we're looking at here, this is on the Y is the average treatment effect in kilowatt hours of electricity consumption per week. This is the change in electricity consumption. And along the X, this is the number of weeks from appliance delivery. 0 here, I think, is defined as the average over the time series. So 0 here, this dashed line represents when the appliances were delivered. And we do see an initial sort of big spike in electricity consumption. But what was sort of disappointing is that over time, that increase sort of disappeared and consumption regressed back towards this mean. Not entirely, but largely. So, there's certainly interest in appliances. It doesn't necessarily mean that consumption is limited by those appliances. Now, we don't have the data to actually, understand exactly why this is happening, but a hypothesis is that their electricity budget is constrained, and so they're simply using their appliances differently. Maybe they bought a television, and now why would you switch on the lights if you have a TV, right? Like, you can just watch TV all day. And we did see different effects for different appliances. So we looked at televisions and speakers, refrigerators, freezers. Consumption changes on TVs and speakers were relatively small, and we did see this regression back towards sort of the original level of consumption. We had more sustained increases in consumption with fridges and freezers. And this is in part, I think, because, well, one, they're larger consumers of electricity, but also that oftentimes they're used for productive reasons. And so the income that's generated can support the electricity use. So we also looked as well then at, well, how do the economics work out for these appliance finance programs? Does it actually work out as a net benefit to the mini grid developers? So one thing we looked at was loan repayment. This figure on the left here, we have on the Y, the proportion of appliance buyers, and on the X, the percent behind on repayment. The ideal curve here would be a vertical line at 0, meaning that nobody is behind on their payment. Each line represents a different time slice. So the repayment period was generally 12 months. So 25% of repayment period would be 3 months, 50% would be 6, and so on and so forth. And so what we see is that progressively over time, they fell further and further behind on their repayment. At the end of the loan term, about 24% had fully repaid their loans. If we look 3 months past that, about 35% had repaid their loans. So it's not as if they stopped paying entirely and defaulted, but a lot of them were not able to make payments on time or not able to make full payments. At the end of the repayment period, about 66% of loans had been, well, 60% of the money loaned out had been repaid. And so if you look at the economics of sort of just the appliance finance program in general, looking at, well, what was the increase in revenue from increasing electricity consumption, minus the costs of running the program plus the repayments on those appliances, what we found is that the freezers, refrigerators paid off. Some of the other less used productive appliances paid off, but generally speaking, things like televisions actually lost money from this perspective. And so our takeaway here was that, if appliance finance is to be successful, and there's clearly a demand for credit to acquire appliances, it makes sense to focus on larger productive appliances. Another sort of quick pilot we ran with the Innovation Lab was a tariff subsidy program. We took 2 other mini grids and reduced their tariffs by 50% and 75%. basically subsidizing the mini grid operators, and tried to understand, well, what effect does this have on electricity consumption for one? So what's the elasticity of demand, but also on revenues, right? So in an ideal situation, you lower prices, consumption goes up, tariffs are lower, but your revenues stay roughly the same. These are mostly solar battery powered systems with excess capacity. So the marginal cost of electricity is actually quite low. What we found was there were large increases in electricity consumption, relatively large in percentage terms. In fact, the site that received a 75% tariff reduction doubled their electricity use. Revenue fell slightly. So the increase in consumption didn't make up for the drop in price, but clearly, elasticity is high, and high tariffs are also a barrier. And I've got a whole other stream of work on subsidies, which I don't have time to talk about now. And in fact, I realize I'm almost at 30 minutes and I'm like halfway through. So I'm going to speed up a little bit here. What did we learn? Certainly there's a high demand for appliances. It seems to be that there's some cost barrier to acquiring those appliances, but the consumption increase wasn't sustained, particularly for non-income generating appliances. So, yes, credit and financial services probably play a role, probably makes more sense to focus on income generation businesses and the like. And so, we really need to think about the system in which these operating, or these electricity systems operate. Finance is an important enabler, but at the same time, you also, if you're operating a business, need to have access to markets, to roads and communication infrastructure. You need to have human capital that's able to drive these productive activities. And so another project that we worked on was looking at specifically at small commercial electricity customers on the grid in rural Kenya, and trying to understand what drives their use of electricity. What's the relationship between, say, being close to a major road and electricity consumption, or having a lot of financial service providers in your community. And so what we did was we took a bunch of data sets we had from the utility Kenya Power, the location of about 210,000 small commercial customers and their connection dates as of December 2015. We had monthly billing data over about a 5-year period for most of those customers, about 182,000. We also know the location and connection date for about 5.5 million Kenya Power residential customers. So we can get a sense for, is the local population around these businesses connected to electricity? We had the 12 million human labeled structures, the locations of those structures from the National Electrification Plan. We also looked at nightlight data, class A and B, which are sort of national and international roads in Kenya as of 2017. And also an interesting data set on the location of financial service providers over time. And so we can look at how the evolution of access to these financial service providers changed over time, and some sort of coarse quarterly GDP county level data. And so what we did is we took each small commercial, we created a buffer of we played with different buffers. We landed on a 500-meter buffer area around each small commercial. And we extracted, what's the density of structures around these small commercials. So, how dense is the settlement? We pulled out how many financial service providers are located in that area based on our data from Kenya Power on connection dates and locations of customers. We could track the electrification rate roughly based on the structures data over that time period of about 5 years, as well as extracting the consumption over time as well. And we ran some panel regression to try and understand what's the relationship between things like structured density, which is sort of the built environment, access to financial services by having local financial service providers, nightlights and GDP is sort of measures of economic activity, electrification rate of structures. And now these ones with the T index, so those are the things that we have over time. So we can look at how did electricity consumption change over time relative to how access to, say, financial services changed over time, as well as the time invariant fixed effect for each small commercial to account for these unobserved factors. Of course, different types of businesses have different sort of base levels of consumption. And so the idea was to try to understand what drives electricity consumption. Our dependent variable here was the electricity consumption of these small commercials. And so we found intuitively that being closer to main roads in rural areas was suggestive of higher electricity consumption, as well as a high electricity access rate in the area around the small commercials, high structure density as well. A bit counterintuitive, we found that higher density of financial service providers and county level GDP were both associated with lower commercial use of electricity. So we dug a little bit deeper there to try and look at, what are the interactions between these different systems? And so basically we built some models to study the interactions between different indicators on electricity use, and we found that in fact financial service providers have a positive effect on electricity use in contexts where there's high access to electricity, for example, and high structure density. And so, this is sort of an ongoing area of investigation, but our takeaway here, the hypothesis is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that the benefits of having financial service providers is limited if you don't have access to electricity, for example, or if you're not in close proximity to roads to access markets. And so we need to think about infrastructure systems, not in isolation, but how they work together. And one of those important systems, and realizing I'm going a little bit long here, is agriculture. More than half of sub-Saharan Africans earn their livelihood from agriculture, and yet productivity is extremely low. Because a lot of this is done manually. In fact, this is me trying to be a subsistence farmer. I lasted 2 days, and I think they were grateful when I left because I think I killed more plants than I planted. But in any case, there's a potential for electricity to increase productivity of agriculture, and at the same time, there's a benefit to these rural electricity service providers in that it increased their revenues and makes them more financially sustainable. And so, well, this is a quote that I often throw out here. I'll summarize for the sake of time, but basically the idea is that there are very few, if any, examples of mass poverty reduction that didn't start with sort of an agricultural revolution where incomes are increased for small family farms. And so if we're thinking about sort of broad-based poverty reduction, agriculture is an essential element. And electricity feeds in at many, essentially along the entire value chain of agricultural products, from irrigation, mechanization, agrochemical inputs, to post-harvest cold storage, drying for crop preservation, all the way to sort of canning, packaging, and so on and so forth. And so another project we've been working on is trying to identify opportunities at the nexus between electricity and irrigation. Typically, these systems are, these sectors are planned in isolation. Rwanda, for example, has a master plan for everything, including an irrigation master plan, which takes no consideration of the national electrification plan, and vice versa. The national electrification plan is based almost entirely on expected household electricity consumption, with no consideration of the potential use of electricity from agriculture where electricity to arrive in these countries. And so something that we've been working on is trying to map out the opportunities at this intersection. And so we've taken an FAO model called AquaCrop, which it's a biophysical crop model. It takes in climate, soil, crop physiology, and field management data and estimates what are water requirements for different crops given different climatic and soil conditions, and what are the expected yields that we would think we would see with that irrigation. So what's essentially the yield gap, what's the benefit and increased yield from that irrigation. And then what we do is we take that water demand data, we pull in information we have on water resources like groundwater depth, and we estimate well, how much electricity would be required to actually lift that water out of the ground and deliver it to the crops. And what we get out of that then are our expected yield benefit, our electricity requirement, and we as well do some simple hydrological modeling on water balance to try and understand, is this actually feasible from a water perspective in any given region? And we map that out spatially, so don't squint too hard to try and read these maps. But the idea here is that we took several case studies, one on Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda for 5 different crops in each of these countries, and we mapped out then spatially where is there potentially the largest gain in productivity from irrigation? How does that intersect with electricity requirements, which might motivate investment in electrical infrastructure? And what are the water requirements? What does that look like in terms of water balance? Where is this feasible from a water perspective? And so then we can combine these different metrics, and what we do is we developed a metric called the levelized cost of irrigation. This is basically looking at what's the cost of the irrigation equipment plus the cost of powering that equipment, divided by essentially the expected increase in yield over time. And so what we get is the dollars per metric ton cost of irrigation for different crops in different countries. So zooming in here, so the top row is Ethiopia. We have different crops across the columns. So the first column here in Ethiopia is TEF. Each dot here represents a woreda, which is like a district in Ethiopia. So it represents the levelized cost of irrigation in each of those districts. Blue here is using traditional cultivars, red is using improved cultivars. It turns out, and I don't have time to go greatly into the details, but happy to talk about it. Fertility levels, so soil fertility and inputs are really important in terms of the benefits of irrigation. Without fertilizer inputs, the benefits of irrigation are much more limited. So we looked at different fertility scenarios. But the idea here is, so these dashed lines represent the range of market prices for these crops that we've observed over the last 10 years. And so if the levelized cost of irrigation is less than the market price of that particular crop or product, then irrigation makes sense. And so the idea is then we can then map out spatially the feasibility of irrigation, both from a water perspective and a cost perspective. And so this is a two-tone map here. So looking at the key on the right, we have water availability. We want to have a high positive water balance. We want to be towards the purple region. We also want to have a low cost of irrigation. So we want to be sort of towards the bottom right of this plot. So purple means we have both high availability of water, or a positive water balance, and a low cost of irrigation. And so what we can do with this tool is help identify opportunities where electricity can sustainably power higher levels of productivity through irrigation in different countries. And so sort of next steps on this project, we're actually working to integrate the data that we're generating from this model into geospatial electrification planning tools so that we can integrate this decision making, because these are interdependent. Irrigation, we want to know where is irrigation economically feasible, which depends on the cost of that electricity to power it. At the same time, these geospatial electrification models are looking to identify the lowest cost source of electricity, which depends strongly on what the actual load is or what the demand is. And so the presence of irrigation is a strong factor in that. And so we're working to try and integrate these, basically integrate the planning of these agricultural systems with electricity systems. And so to quickly conclude, because I've gone way over, so the goal of electricity access is not actually connections, although SDG 7 is universal access to modern energy. It really goes beyond that. We need to think about, is electricity improving well-being? So this access isn't just a technology problem. We need to think about how that energy gets used. And so this requires some systems thinking. to be truly sustainable? How do electricity access programs intersect with other infrastructure systems, with agriculture, with finance, transport, communications, and so on and so forth. And so I will leave it at that because I would love to have some back and forth in Q&A. My email is here as well. I would love to hear from you if you're interested.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And I want to invite our audience to please put your questions in the chat, and we'll be taking live questions here. Could you go back just to slide 30 for a second here? I mean,
Sure,
I think this is a really interesting talk, and I want to thank you so much for really providing so much data with which we can kind of think about these issues in a more critical way. And I appreciate that those of us who work in the energy sector often talk about demand, but as Stephen Doig says, you know, people want hot showers and cold beer. And that, you know, thinking about where energy intersects with our critical societal needs, not demand, but just critical societal needs. And I would want to make sure that you added on healthcare here as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I've appreciated how so many outcomes are really dependent on very basic levels of energy. And just as we're starting this conversation with the participants, how much per kilowatt hour does electricity cost? I don't remember hearing that number, and I just want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page as we start this conversation.
Yeah, so, and I guess cost to who is another question.
Cost to whom, right.
You know, so if we're talking about off-grid systems, you know, a lot of the mini grid operators I work with, you know, it costs, you know, $1. I would say $1 a kilowatt hour is a sort of rough benchmark.
$1 per I mean, you mentioned that the average American home is using 850 kilowatt hours a month, and in Kenya they're using about 30 kilowatt hours a month. And so I think in the US we're paying anywhere from 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. And then here it's about $1 per kilowatt hour for your off-grid systems. That's
right. Now, and if you're talking about you know, grid electricity that depends on the country, in Rwanda, you know, for your sort of first 15 kilowatt hours, it's around 10 cents. I think similar in Kenya, it doubles as you increase that's just the tariff structure. But the actual cost to provide that electricity is much higher. And the project that I'm working on now that I didn't talk about because of time is looking at, can we actually quantify the sort of implicit subsidy that flows towards grid extension? You know, if you just take, you know, how much money is coming in from these connections versus how much do they cost, and you know, Kenya Power is losing, you know, in the study area, you know, $3,000 on average, maybe $3,000 per customer to connect them over the lifetime of those connections. And so the tariff isn't the real cost; it's the price. It's not the cost.
Okay, fair enough. And then it's also the price relative to what, and you mentioned that. So I appreciate that people in urban areas are richer than people in rural areas. If you're using your 30 kilowatt hours of electricity at a dollar a watt, I mean, or kilowatt, how much what percentage of your income is that?
It's a lot. Well, and I mean, if you look at the off-grid systems, they're using maybe 100 watt hours per day, which comes to maybe, you know, 3 kilowatt hours. So they're maybe spending $3 per month on electricity, which one isn't sustainable for the provider, but it, you know, still represents, in terms of cash income, a relatively large amount of income. Because a lot of
I think in Burundi, it was around $250 per capita annual income.
Annually, exactly.
And so when you're thinking about what this means for a family in a small rural area, then that's still a significant chunk of change.
Well, and we're just talking about the cost per unit energy. The cost to connect to the electricity grid in Kenya used to be about $300. Now it's subsidized. It's around $100. Well, it was subsidized at $300. Now it's subsidized at about $100. But even still, for a lot of households, that represents a huge chunk of their annual income. And
income.
A barrier just to connect.
And the other piece that you mentioned was the cost of borrowing money, and you said that was 30%. That's when
30% was sort of the market.
That's when I choked on my water. I was drinking some water and did one of those little splurt moments. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just taking rates compared to sort of microfinance rates that you find in these sorts of settings, right? Interest rates are very high.
And that is high because of the perceived risk, or that is high because, can you help us understand that finance piece that underlies this energy story?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it is risk, but interest rates in general in these countries are higher. I mean, for one thing, inflation is higher, and so interest
Okay.
rates are going to be higher just because of the, the rate of inflation.
Mhm.
But sort of sovereign interest, like countries pay interest at a higher rate as well, just because of the general sort of national risk profile. So yeah, there's a combination of all of these things, but and as well because these investments are upfront capital investments as well, that cost of capital becomes even more important, and that's often overlooked as well. In fact, another project that I'm working on that you actually helped connect me with Toby at ETH and one of his PhD students, Churchill, looking at, well, what effect does cost of capital, if we look at actual realistic rates differentiated by technology and by geography or by country, what effect does that have on your electrification planning? And so often overlooked, but actually very important, is the cost of capital as well.
No, these are really interesting questions, because that intersection of being able to provide, the societal needs of our energy system goes so far beyond just individuals having appliances in their homes. And so I'm wondering how your work does affect schools and hospitals and healthcare facilities, any other municipal buildings or others.
Yeah, I mean, how does it affect
intersect with, or I mean, are those also areas that you're thinking about or looking at in terms of your electrification energy provision stories? Because I mean, energy it's listed in the Sustainable Development Goals, but it really powers a lot of them.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I sort of alluded to that I almost don't think electricity access should be the goal. It underlies all of them, right? It's not the end state that we're looking for, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I could come up with examples of how this plugs in across the spectrum. When I spent those 2 years in Burkina Faso, I remember one of my best friends was a nurse in the clinic, and they had no electricity. And so if somebody was giving birth at night, then he'd have like a flashlight stuck on his neck while he was trying to deliver a baby, right?
Yeah, there's worse health outcomes. We have the data there, right? If you give birth at night without So
it's absolutely critical. I mean, I think from the perspective of electricity planning, these are the types of facilities that get targeted first, because one, they're critical infrastructure from a social perspective, and two, they're a more reliable load. I mean, there's a lot of risk on payment as well, and low consumption. So there's depending on the country you're talking about, the government might be a more reliable payer.
That's fair. That's fair.
But yeah, so I mean, those are usually sort of, and so they sort of can act as anchors to these sorts of electrification projects too.
We have a question here from Richard Sandford, if we could see the colored agricultural geospatial distribution maps again. And my question as you're pulling those up too is, given the appliances, if you've ever thought about looking at the gendered use of energy in any of your studies. I just appreciate that there's a lot of interesting kind of Nordic research looking at men and women use electricity quite differently. And sometimes our programs are going for one kind of use, but maybe not other kinds of use, and how that could potentially change in terms of loan programs or access to different types of appliances.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge gender aspect to electricity access, and I don't have any specific projects that look at that in particular, but I mean, just looking at who bears the burden of lack of access to electricity versus who typically is making the decisions, there's a big disparity there, right? Just sort of collecting firewood, for example, versus using more modern forms of energy, that typipally falls on women. Water
ironing
pumping,
clothes to get the chiggers out of your undergarments.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a big divide between who decides and who actually benefits.
And when you were looking at these maps that looked at water and cost of irrigation, did you ever do anything looking at different climate regimes or different kind of future projected hydrological regimes that could be affected by climate change?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And actually, I had something about this, and I was already over time, and so I pulled it out. But I mean, one of the benefits to irrigation really is that it's an insurance policy in many ways, right? Even if you don't increase your average productivity by that much, it stabilizes your yields. And so you're not as susceptible to natural rainwater patterns. And so we haven't looked, so what we've done is we have modeled this on 10 years of historical climate data, and we can actually see sort of the rain-fed yields versus the irrigated yields, and you can see how irrigation would de-risk these smallholder farmers and improve food security. Something we've been looking at as a future project is then looking at future climate scenarios and how is irrigation likely to potentially be even more important in mitigating climate change for smallholder agriculture in the future. But so on our radar, but we haven't done it yet.
No. And there's been a ton of really cool work that we've seen with colleagues in India who are working on those really portable, low-cost irrigation schemes for smallholder farmers. And so I just think that this question in a climate changing world is one that is so hugely important. And I appreciated your comment that the planning of the grid and the planning of, or like energy access and the planning of irrigation were completely divorced from one another. And so thinking about those conversations in concert, it really does bring together partners that haven't historically worked together.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a technical piece to that, but I think the bigger piece is more is an institutional problem, which is much more hairy and difficult to address.
Those human beings getting in the way.
Yeah, all the time. We're just trying to help them out. Why can't we just, talk to each other? So it's a messy problem for sure. And the technology piece is probably it definitely is the easier part.
So one of the pieces on that that really struck me here is you did look at refrigeration, but I know that a lot of food loss in sub-Saharan Africa also has to do with just spoilage or kind of that, once you harvest, from harvest to eat, the loss of food in terms of processing and others. And I'm wondering if you had any projects that kind of address that stage of the energy food cycle.
That's something that we're starting to look at, and that's another slide that I pulled out to try and slim this down to 30 minutes unsuccessfully. But
you're going to come back. We're inviting you to the building behind me. Just this is the beginning of a conversation, Nathan, not the end of a conversation.
That's fantastic, and so we'll have more on that by then. Just anecdotally, I've seen it firsthand. Like again, coming back to my experience in Burkina, they benefited from having a small dam that could store water after the rainy season to do gardening. But because they had no access to road infrastructure, the vehicles that came and took those vegetables to the city came last, right? And so by the time they came, half of it was spoiled. And I kept telling them, you just eat it like your children are malnourished. Like that's our cash income for the entire year. We can't eat our money, right? So it's a huge challenge. And, so we've started this sort of project looking at the nexus between electricity and agriculture at primary production, because that's sort of the natural starting point, increased productivity. But this is a system, right? It's part of an integrated value chain, and so you could double your yield, but if you can't get those products to market, then what value is it actually? And so something that I have one of my newer PhD students working on is trying to characterize the different types of loads along value chains, so that we can try and model out what would be the energy requirement, how centralized are those activities, how would they be sort of spatially distributed, how would you think about powering those?
I have a question here from Afsal. What actually prevents the extension of the central grid? Is it a cost issue, political issues, or geographic barriers?
Yes, I mean, it's primarily a cost issue, that it's expensive, right? I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars per kilometer of medium voltage line to power some LED light bulbs and some cell phones, charge some cell phones. So so there's a huge upfront cost. Now, I mean, you could extend power lines everywhere. It might not make sense because it would be less expensive to generate that electricity locally,
given the low levels of utilization from the people in rural areas. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue there then.
It is, right? And so, well, this gets into a much more complex discussion, but the challenge there is that institutionally, there's this natural cross-subsidization of rural electrification in that, in fact, rural customers typically pay a lower rate for their electricity because they take advantage of these lifeline tariffs. And yet they use less electricity and they cost more to connect. Now, in the off-grid sector, these are typically, well, not by any fundamental sort of necessity, driven by the private sector, which doesn't have access to these sorts of sort of institutionalized subsidies, which is why you pay $1 on a kilowatt hour or $1 kilowatt hour on a mini grid and 10 cents if you have a grid connection.
No, I really appreciate. There's a question here in the chat as well about electrification and kind of availability of internet access and cell phone access. I mean, living in rural Vermont, we have lousy cell phone reliability, and it was always better when I was in East Africa. And so I think a lot of people here don't necessarily appreciate that, the connectivity of mobile phones in East Africa is a lot better than the electric network.
What's fascinating is that a lot of this off-grid electrification has been enabled by mobile technology. Right? Like these solar home systems are all connected to the cellular network. They make their payments with their cell phone.
Yeah, with mobile pay in Kenya.
Exactly. And so they can just send a payment from their cell phone and unlock their system or top up their meter on a mini grid. And a lot of this is what it has enabled operating in these remote areas to be more cost effective rather than having somebody going around these remote areas trying to collect small amounts of cash. Right. And so mobile technology.
Only by having that mobile technology. Now, I want to give you a minute or two to kind of wrap up your big thoughts and kind of tell us where you're going next in your research on this. This is such an important topic and one that I know we all are very interested in. So I'd love to hear kind of where you're going next and where you see some of the big contours driving your work.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. So I mean, the big focus on this electricity agriculture nexus and trying to understand, how can we connect these sectors. We're working on a pilot now in Uganda to try and sort of pilot some small scale irrigation, solar irrigation, to try to understand just the practical piece, right? Modeling it at a high level is one thing, but how does it work on the ground is a completely different challenge. Trying to think beyond irrigation and down value chains, because these things are all interconnected, right? And so it's not just a matter of increasing primary production if you don't have the capacity to store, process, and get those crops to market. So how do we think about that? And then, I guess at a higher level, thinking how does electricity play into the bigger development picture, right? What needs to come with it? And so, developing a project now with some partners looking at developing time series data from satellite imagery on how rural economies have evolved over time, how has agricultural practice changed over time, and how does that relate to changes in access to infrastructure like roads and electricity and communications and finance and things like this. And so, there's been a lot of these sort of very focused impact assessments on electricity access to say in this particular community over 2 years, we didn't see a lot of change in income. But can we look at a national scale and see how these different things relate to each other, right? What are those sets of conditions that need to be in place that can inform policymakers and how they roll out infrastructure and investment in rural communities?
This is fantastic. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work is your ambitions are enormous, and you're backing it up with the empirical data and actual field experience to make what you do as relevant as possible. So Nathan, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. It's an absolute treat to have you here on this series. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Like I said, let's make this the beginning and not the end. And just wanted to thank you for being part of the New Energy series. And I think that wraps it up for the New Energy series for this term. There will be a few in the summer, and then we're going to be starting again in the fall. So again, for everybody watching, please send the names of your friends and colleagues. And we look forward to hearing from the best and greatest new rising stars in the energy space. So with that, have a wonderful summer, everybody. And I'm going to go write my law textbook now. Take care. And thanks again, Nathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.